Good morning, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. On behalf of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies, I would like to welcome our audience to the final lecture of the academic year. My name is Sanjyot Mehendale, and I teach on the material and visual culture of Central Asia in the Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures Department. And I also serve as the inaugural chair of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. Just as a reminder for our online audiences, please type your questions into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom, on the bottom bar of the Zoom window. Please do not type them into the chat function, which will be monitored by our staff in case of technical difficulties. Special welcome to our speaker today, Sonja Brentjes, who unfortunately wasn't able to travel to Berkeley in person, but has kindly agreed to give her talk on Zoom. Dr. Brentjes is a historian of science with particular focus on institutions, mathematics, and mapmaking in pre-1700 Islamic societies. She's also a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. Dr. Brentjes has an amazing educational backstory. She initially was interested in mathematics, which she studied in Dresden in the late 60s and early 70s, long before the unification of Germany. She followed that up with a focus on the history of mathematics and science at the Karl Marx University in Leipzig, and studied Near Eastern history and Arabic at the Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg, eventually completing her first Ph.D. on the history of linear programming and a second on number theory in Arabic and Persian texts. She has a long list of publications, including most recently in early 2023 as co-editor with Peter Barker and Rana Brentjes, the publication of the Routledge Handbook on the Sciences in Islamic Societies, for which she also wrote a number of chapters on madrasas, systems of knowledge, and cultural practice, respectively. Later this year, Routledge will publish the historiography of the history of science in Islamic societies, practices, concepts, and questions. Among her earlier work, in addition to what was mentioned in her uploaded biography in relation to her talk today, are Globalization of Knowledge in the Post-Antique Mediterranean, 700 to 1500, and with Tanner Idis and Lutz Richter-Bernberg as co-editors, 1001 Distortion, How or How Not to Narrate History of Science, Medicine, and Technology in Non-Western Cultures. She's involved in many research and writing projects, including a book on Al-Khazini's book on the balance of wisdom, and a project on the visualization and material cultures of the heavens in Eurasia and North Africa from 4000 BCE to 1700 CE. Concerning the latter, she's part of a large team that created and curates the image database Visualization and Cultures of the Heavens, which developed in a framework of an eponymous working group and which compiled thousands of visual forms and formats of astral knowledge from Eurasian history of almost 6,000 years. The collection includes calendars and other media, instruments, tables, objects of art or architecture with star constellations, planets, and other heavenly inhabitants or phenomena in anthropomorphic, zoomorphic, diagrammatic, or semiotic formats, as well as theoretical models. It is in this context that we welcome her here today to speak on the spread, appropriation, transformation, transmutation of astral images across Eurasia. In her talk, Images and Knowledge of the Stars Along the Silk Road Between the 5th and 15th Century. Welcome, Sonja.
Thank you very much, Sanjyot. I'm very happy to be with you. And I think my first task is to open the screen, yeah?
Yes.
All right, there we are. Sanjyot already said, and you know it from the announcement, the topic of my talk is astral imagery and astral knowledge along the Silk Road between the 5th century Common Era and the 15th century. So it's a survey, of course. And the structure of the talk is I will give you a very, very brief introduction where basically run you through what we have found with our database, what kind of knowledge spread through Eurasia in these 1,000 years, and which are the main cultures that were involved. And then comes the first part, which actually is the main part of the talk, about the zodiac in Central and East Asia based on our database. And at the second part, later today, I will talk a little bit based on secondary literature about the migration of astral concepts, methods, and images between China and West Asia. So here you see one of the cover images of our database. And if you are interested, then please contact us, in particular our digital content curator, Sonja Brentjes. And you see we have sorted our material in different collections so that we can say, okay, let's talk about China today, or let's talk about India or early modern Europe. This brings me now to which kind of astral knowledge did we learn from the images, from objects in public collections, museums, and private collections that spread in Eurasia until the early modern period. You see here the first part of my talk is the Greco-Mesopotamian zodiac, but it's not the only one. It's linked with the Egyptian decans and different types of lunar mentions that developed in particular in South and East Asia, but also was then applied in West Asia and in Europe. The second smaller package is a planetary week that came into being in the Roman Empire and in modern terms of geography in Italy. The third larger package of knowledge that traveled are planets, is knowledge about planets, and at the same time, their representation and transformation as deities, and so as rituals and art objects. Again, a smaller package are calendars and eras, and with that, the more technical aspect of the knowledge transfer begins, followed up by transfer of planetary models, their parameters, and methods of calculations to determine these parameters and other important values, and of course, instruments. And finally, astrology, which I could have, of course, also placed, let's say, to the zodiac or to the planets and their deities. But astrology is, of course, in different periods and in different regions of Eurasia, culturally very mixed discipline. The cultures that we learned from our project that were involved are many. Great cultures, also smaller cultures, but we are still looking for the go in between these big cultures. So I mentioned already Mesopotamia, Greece, Egypt, and the Roman Empire, but other Middle Eastern cultures also participated in this transfer, in particular of the zodiac, such as the Nabateans and Palmyra, or Jewish communities at the Dead Sea, like Qumran. We have Iran in two major long-term periods, the pre-Islamic times, and then the many centuries of the Islamic period, where Iran was very important for transfer and exchange. You will hear in the second part a little bit more about it. North and South Asia was also in the pre-Islamic period of several centuries important for picking up information from the Mediterranean and delivering it, using it at home, of course, but delivering it to the North, Central Asia, and to the East, to China and other cultures in East Asia. And in the Islamic period, it is an exchange within South Asia between Indic cultures and Islamic cultures, but it's also going mostly to the West in this period. Central Asia is, in the same sense, pre-Islamic important. You will hear in the first part something about it. And in the Islamic period, it is sometimes a very vibrant center of astral knowledge and knowledge production. And when we come sort of to the east, we have, of course, China as a big player in different dynasties with different territorial distributions. Japan was important and is important today because a number of sources that have been lost in other regions are still available in temples and libraries in Japan. And so we can reconstruct some of the material for China and Central Asia, for instance. Occasionally, Tibet is an important relay station or recipient, for instance, the planetary week. Korea, through its relationships to China in the later periods, is indeed also participating in this exchange. And at least to my surprise, because I actually know nothing about Java, Eastern Java from the 12th century onwards seems to have been engaged with Hindu circles in South Asia and has taken over parts of the zodiac. So that leads us to what I here summarizingly call the general picture, which is relatively simple. What I want to describe here, there is an impressive number of elements that belong to astral knowledge and moved across Eurasia. It did so over many centuries, but in very different modes. So not all the elements that we have found in the objects and their imagery were indeed spread evenly across Eurasia, both in terms of territory and in terms of chronology. So some arrived earlier, others arrived later, others stopped somewhere in the middle of Eurasia or in the middle of Asia, better to say, and never came to East Asia, and others never came to Europe. So you have a very variegated picture of how astral knowledge and images traveled and spread. From the perspective of the Silk Road, the main carriers that enabled the spreading of knowledge and imagery were four, in my view at least. Religions, and for the territory I'm talking about, it's primarily Hinduism and Buddhism. Islam, you may expect for my second topic, doesn't play a role qua religion, but as a culture. Then we have, of course, conquest and politics in many of the big empires that existed in these 1,000 years, which were engaged in different forms of exchange, for instance, by beauty, no, not by beauty, by booty, which is a different thing, of course, than beauty, and trade to some degree, but also diplomatic efforts and gift giving. We have processes of acculturation, in particular in the material I'm going to show you visible to the Sinicized neighbors in the north of the Tang dynasty and the Song dynasty in the Chinese territories. And as a fourth element, of course, scholarly travels and translations. And here again, people from very different ethnic groups, from very different regions and adhering to different faiths, were participating in exchanging and merging different types of knowledge. And we will see and hear a little bit about that later. Here you see a brief image, not a brief image, a brief survey on what kind of images for Central and East Asia is in our database and how it is distributed and quantitatively set up. You see individual elements in Central Asia for the pre-Islamic period, in Korea and at the Chinese coast. And you see several more elements represented by the numbers on the mainland of China and in Japan. Of course, these are not all elements, not all images that exist, but we have serious problems with acquiring images of such objects from China or from Japan and their institutions. So if there are people among you who have good contact, please get in contact with us and help us to acquire more images. I'm now with the first part. I want to talk about the zodiac in Central and East Asia, about basically 5 either periods or regions. I start with the Tarim Basin in Central Asia, then go very briefly to Tang, China, and spend a little bit more time with 2 Sini-sized dynasties, the Liao and the Shishir, and then show you 2 images from our collection about Japan. Since perhaps not all of you, like myself, are experts in the Silk Road, I thought I should show you one of the many images available at the internet about the main trajectories of the Silk Road. And you see on the upper part, the Tarim Basin with cities like Kucha and Turfan, which I will mention, and Dunhuang to the east, from which I will also show you an image. And what is important for the Tarim Basin at the very least, but also of the later Indo-Chinese relationships, are the Indian trade routes and the connections. They are only represented here symbolically, because we have learned that there are many more routes that connected South Asia with the Tarim Basin. And here's the first object we found. It's today in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. It comes from Kucha, so one of these city-states in the northeastern Tarim Basin. The Hermitage dates at approximately to the 6th century. An art historian and specialist for Kucha, Monica Zinn, with whom we have very close cooperative relations, thinks it's rather a century later. And what you see here is one way of the combination of religious messages with the zodiac. It's a corridor in an unspecified cave in Kucha. Unspecified because the Russian explorers at the beginning of the 20th century didn't number the caves and didn't make a note which cave this image comes from. But you see on the straight wall of the corridor, so at the lower register here of the image, scenes of Buddha's death, the parinirvana, and at the curved upper part of the corridor, you see 5 remainders, 5 signs of the zodiac. So we copied the images because on the image from the Hermitage, they are a little bit too small. So you can see, I hope, most of these images. In the upper left corner, you see Aries, followed by Taurus. And on the right, because it's even more difficult to recognize, you see the next following sign, Gemini, 2 figures with a brown loincloth and a kind of coat or robe. And below, you see this other little fragment, which shows you Leo and Virgo. Now, what's interesting about this is, of course, the combination with the Buddhist death themes. And so the question is, what could that mean? And Monica Zinn, in a discussion, proposed it is one way of representing eternal time. And of course, I accept because she is the expert of how to interpret Buddhist murals. So it has a different function than what we usually think about the zodiac. This goes well together with the dissolution of the circular structure of the zodiac. Usually, before this project started, I would not have dreamt about the zodiac being arranged in a linear sequence, as here in this Kucha cave. And the third element is the change of images. So when you think about how Taurus, for instance, is represented in the Mediterranean zodiac images, then usually what you have is a protome, so the head of the bull and the chest. Here you have a full-bodied bull that seems to be prancing, moving forward, and its tail is raised. Please remember that when we look at later images. The same type of body posture you see with Leo, only that there you see more clearly than in the case of Taurus, that the right paw is raised. The tail is raised, and the only difference to later images of Leo is the surprisingly non-leonine head. The poor Leo rather looks, in my view, like a fox or maybe a little dog. So maybe the people in Kucha never have seen a lion. I honestly don't know. Very interesting, however, or even more interesting than these changes is the non-changed, if you want to, representation of Gemini. This first challenged us to understand, partially because of the difficulties with the visibility, how to understand this representation. So, as I said, one of the two figures wears a brown lengthcoin, so that should be a male, while the right one seems to have something on the back, a kind of coat or maybe a piece of cloth, so it could be a woman. That would not be surprising, because Gemini, coming from India, has been transformed in the Indian context in many, many representations, indeed, into a female-male couple. That's a complicated process about which I will not talk right now. But this interpretation would be wrong, because actually these are two male figures. The left is Heracles, and the right is Apollo. And in Greek sources, it's reported that Apollo loved to wear female dress. So if that's the correct interpretation, then we have here one of a few images that are still very, very close to the Mediterranean pictorial representation of some of the zodiac signs, which is one of the features of the transfer of knowledge, that some of these images preserve much older ancestors. This brings me to the next, the second example that we found for the Tarim Basin in this time a little bit further to the east, and a century or 150 years later. Again, this is an undated object. You see, as in the case of Kucha, this object is fragmentary, but it's not a mural. It is a scroll on Chinese paper. The French colleagues René and Pinot have tried to reconstruct the sequence of the pieces. And here you see in the big image their proposal how it should be arranged. And when you can read the names written below the images and have some familiarity with South Asia, you will immediately recognize a strong Indian component, like with Surya, Indra, Yama, Agni, Vaishravana, and below the last image in the right corner, Iriti. What are they? Except for Surya, the others are so-called Dikpalas. This means they are representations of the cardinal and the semi-cardinal directions, but they are not complete. In the religious context, these representations of the directions have been transformed in the so-called guardian kings, which then spread really widely across East Asia up to Japan, also in a Buddhist context. Only Surya never was part of this set of deities. Then comes Sirius, and there's a question mark because we do not understand what Sirius has as a function in this sequence. And then we come to the zodiac. And René and Pinault thought here the painter made a mistake because he starts with Pisces and goes to Aquarius to end then at the end with Aries, which would be upside down. But I think the painter did not at all make a mistake because this is exactly the sequence of the zodiac as described by one of the most famous medieval astrologers of Western India, Varahamihira. So there may be not only for the Dikpalas, but also for the zodiac, a clear Indian background for this manuscript. And since the images are so small, I just copied two where you can easily recognize the zodiac, Libra, the balance, and down there, Leo. Leo still has this prancing body gesture and his raised tail, as in the case of the mural in Kucha. But this time, Leo has a very leonine face with an opened mouth and a very interesting mane, a thick mane, which we find on Sasanian silver work, but also in representations of the zodiac in later Islamic sources. So in this case, we may have a smaller element here in this document that speaks of a connection not only to South Asia, but also to West Asia, to some Iranian groups, not necessarily as sometimes is written to Persians, that's not the case, but there were, of course, Iranian groups in the Tarim Basin, the Zogdians, for instance. What you also see that is that there are more figures in these images of the zodiac signs than to be accepted or expected, or less figures than to be expected. The proposal by René and Pinault is that these are the Egyptian decans that you see here, which is possible, but they are incomplete. And so this is another major question. Why did the painter from Turfan only represent one or two decans if they are the decans? This brings me to my third object from the Tarim Basin, from its easternmost corner, Dunhuang. For all who work on Chinese cross-cultural contacts, exchange of knowledge and related issues, of course, know Dunhuang much better than perhaps Kucha. And this map shows you to whom or to which empire Dunhuang belongs in the 11th century, namely to the Xixia or Western Xixia, the Tanguts, and not to China, neither to the Liao. But to all of them, it belonged at some point. So it's a very cosmopolitan region. And here is one of the two images in the Mogao Cave 61, which is a very interesting painting, again, in a similar context like the painting in Kocha, but with a different theme. What you see in the center is, of course, a Buddha, but it is a Buddha that is unknown in the Indian context. There are no texts known and no images known of this Buddha, whom a Japanese colleague who worked as one of the first people on this theme calls the Teja Prabha Buddha, or the Buddha of the blazing light. This is a cosmic Buddha, and you see his cosmic relevance with the entourage the painter constructed around him. You have planets, more than 5 actually, usually 9, but in some contexts with the Teja Prabha Buddha also 11. And when you watch the painting more closely in a better resolution maybe, you will find a number of zodiac signs, small circles added in between. And so I copied 3 that you can see at least a few of them. Up there is Gemini, in this case, indeed, a male-female couple. Below you have Libra, this time in a very widespread pictorial type of an East Asian market balance. And then you have Pisces, possibly in an adaptation to a Buddhist concept of two fishes as one of the 8 Buddhist treasures. What you also may understand here, that this process of separating the zodiac signs from their original scientific meaning and transforming them into a clear religious message as part of the entourage of a Buddha is even further developed than in the Kocha case, because here you have no structure of the zodiac signs left. They are just little blobs in this big procession of the Tejaprama. This brings me to the second part of the zodiac for East Asia, and this time the Tang dynasty, so China, and as I said, 2 of its north and Sini-sized neighbors, first the Liao and then the Xixia. And you see that the Tang dynasty really spread very far and now included, at least as protectorates, also the Tarim Basin and Dunhuang. Unfortunately, I was unable to find a kind of real Tang image, but fortunately here the Japanese collections can help. This is a copy of 1294 of a series of copies of a text with many pictorial scrolls in a Buddhist context that was translated and repainted around 714 at the Tang court in Shan'an. And so the story goes, there was a Buddhist from Eastern India at the court, and he translated it from some Indic language, possibly Sanskrit, into Chinese. And then at the early 9th century, around 814, a Japanese monk who had come to China and received Buddhist education copied some of the scrolls and brought them back to Japan. And so here we are. And that's a very fascinating document. It's only here the zodiac, the lunar mentions are also in the 2 scrolls that are extant, and many, many Buddhist deities and bodhisattvas. Why is this representation of the zodiac fascinating? Well, because it immediately again visually shows us the intermingling of different cultural strands of the transmission of the zodiac. So when you look at Gemini, left of Aries, and then go down to Virgo, below Leo, you see the Buddhist pictorial format. But when you go up to Leo, you see still the same body posture with a sort of jumping and the raised tail, but the leonine head now resembles much more a Chinese type of Leo than a Central Asian or Iranian type of. When you go to the left margin of the piece of paper from the scroll, you see a particular type of water pot with a particular decoration and 3 lotus flowers. When you count through the signs, you know, of course, that this is Aquarius. But the form of Aquarius has nothing to do with what we can find in the Middle East or in the Mediterranean. And again, a comparison with Buddhist material, other paintings of Mahayana Buddhism, then reveals that this is a further cultural translation. The water pot of Aquarius has here been translated in another of the 8 Buddhist treasures, the water pot. But there's a second, in my view, fascinating cultural element in this sequence of the zodiac signs. Here are 2 sequences. When you start at the right from Aries going down up to Gemini, etc., you see that in the last case, this sequence is broken. You do not go up again. There should be Capricorn, but they are the Pisces. So the last row in this representation does not fit the previous rows. The previous rows very clearly show a sequence that reflects Chinese writing and reading styles from the top right corner down, again, up to the top, down, etc., to the left. So it may well be that the left representation was the representation found in the ancestor of these scrolls in the Indian context. And the final element, which is a different type of quite interesting exchange of knowledge, is the image of Libra. Everybody should expect here a quite different image, namely some representation of the equal armed balance. But what we have here is an unequal armed balance, and more precisely, a Roman steelyard. That's a highly fascinating issue because we have no evidence that a material object, Roman steelyard, was available either in Tang, China, or in Kamakura, Japan. So it must have been a transformation of an image that happened earlier and was here now spread to the east in the form of this Roman balance. This brings me now to the Khitans and the Tanguts, and you see where they are in 11th century, the Liao to the northeast, followed by the Xia to the southwest. These are two fairly famous ceilings from Liao tombs. On the right, the two images are of a tomb built in the year 1116 for a Han Chinese Buddhist called Zhanji Jing. And on the left, I don't know who the person is for whom the tomb was built. This is at the border to Sung, China, in Datong. And you see that there are different types of celestial representations at the ceiling. On the right, the ceiling in the two images shows a lotus flower as a fundamental Buddhist symbol. It is followed in the next circle by star constellations that represent the lunar mansions, the Chinese lunar mansions. I have to underline, and along in the outer circle, we have then the zodiac signs. They are a little small, and I show you enlarged images in the next slide. But on the left, it seems to be the case we only have the lunar mansion. The rest is missing, but it doesn't look like that in the inner circle there was a zodiac sign. So people had different choices that they could make what to represent in their ceilings, and it's an important element, at least for this period. And here, some user of Twitter was so generous to put better images, enlarged images of some of the zodiac signs to our availability. You see on the left, in the lower register, a wonderful little lion, not very lionesque, but still with the same body posture. So there is stability and continuity. You see Gemini in cine-sized Liao dress as a female and a male. We see one of the versions of the East Asian equal arm balance. But then on the upper register on the left, you see two transformed zodiac signs, namely Sagittarius, who is no longer a centaur, but a man with a bow and possibly an arrow, which cannot be seen, and a horse. This is an image we still find in the 15th century in Ming painting. So that's relatively easy to understand what happened here, but its neighbor is Capricorn, and it's very cute. It still has its fish tail from the Mesopotamian context, but the goat head has been transformed somehow into a dragon head. At least this is what most colleagues think this head is representing because of the tongue. And then this animal has wings. And from where these wings come, I have to admit, we do not know. And finally, a little later, then the Liao tombs, possibly half a century, and then in the left case, a century later, three of the examples from the Xixia. You see Venus on the right, easily recognizable by its Iranian type of string instrument, the pipa. And you see Mars in the center, here represented clearly as an Indic deity with its four arms. And you see zodiac sign for Venus Taurus and for Mars Scorpio, which is a clear expression of the astrological meaning of this painting. And we know that from the Tang period onwards, not only the images were diffused, either from Indic context or from Central Asia or both, because we have people at the Tang court coming from both regions, but also astrological texts. And so here we have two of the few images where this astrological connotation is made explicit. The left image is rather crowded. We have again the Teja Prabha as a center, surrounded by the luminaries, in this case only 10, it should be 11. So you have the Western Asian Mediterranean component with the 5 planets, including the sun and the moon. You have, in addition, the 7 planets, of course, with the sun and the moon. And you have an Indic connotation with Rahu and Ketu, the eclipse, the causer of the eclipse, Rahu or eclipse dragon, as in other contexts. And Ketu starts its life as a comet, but then becomes this other half of the eclipse dragon, or the ascending and the descending lunar nodes. And at the end of this humanoid interpretation of astral bodies, you see a lady with very red cheeks. That's a Chinese type of celestial body, which is not clear what it is. Some people think it's a lunar apogee. It's Yuebo. And above Yuebo, you see 2 zodiac signs. And on the other side of the nimbus of the Teja Prabha Buddha, you see 2 more zodiac signs, and the rest that's missing here is on the top of the painting, just over the nimbus of the Buddha. So again, you have this message: the zodiac signs are deified, are part of the entourage of the Buddha, but have no scientific significance in this context. And finally, 2 of the objects from Japan, of course, also from a Buddhist context. They represent a more complex depiction of the zodiac. It's integrated in the same sense as in the other images that I showed you, in a religious context. In the center, as you can see in the circular representation, but also in what is actually a rectangular representation, there is a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. And this is surrounded by the luminaries, so the planets, plus an addition from the Chinese astral tradition, the Northern Dipper. And when you go in the second circle, or in the second rectangular surrounding called the core, you find the zodiac signs combining Chinese and Indic elements. And in the outer court, you have again the lunar mentions. So there's a very stable religious combination of central celestial bodies. They are used both for religious rituals, but also in Japan for Buddhist astrology. So what happened now during all these west-east migrations of the zodiac? In the textual form, we have translations into several languages, back and forth. We have, on the pictorial level, the identification of the material from the West with symbols, mythological beings, and a change of status in relationship to other celestial beings, as I have shown you. We have an integration of the Mediterranean West Asian zodiac into local knowledge and belief systems in different ways. And we have a transformation of an originally scientific concept, as I've underlined a few times, into religious practices, and a loss in this context, not everywhere, but in this particular context, and strongly so in the pictorial context, a loss of the scientific meaning of the zodiac. This brings me to my second part, which is now on the more theoretical level and has less images. So it's not so colorful anymore. It is about migration of astral concepts, methods, and some images between China, in this case, two dynasties, as I will say in a moment, and West Asia, also two dynasties. Here, as I said, this is based on my reading of papers by other researchers. And what struck me first was that there are very different evaluations of these knowledge transfers and their impact in the new culture where they arrive and get dealt with. These differences have something to do also with the different qualifications of the authors of the papers, namely historians of astral sciences and cultural historians of knowledge have a very different view on how to deal with the transfer of knowledge than historians of medicine or art historians. There's one approach by the historians of medicine and art historians that tells a success story of exchange, cooperation, and appropriation in all three fields that they treat, namely the astral sciences, medicine, and the arts, but only for one of the dynasties, or two, if you want to, but belonging to the same group, namely the Mongol period, the Mongol dynasty in China, and the Mongol dynasty in Iran. While the historians of astral sciences and cultural knowledge transfer tell profoundly different stories, A, for the Mongol dynasty and the Ming dynasty, the second Chinese dynasty I'm going to talk about, and B, for the two sciences, namely for the astral sciences and medicine. And so I thought it might be interesting to summarize for both the Mongols and the Mings the most interesting features that I found in these papers with regard to astral knowledge. And so let's start with the Mongols in the 13th and first half of the 14th century. As I already said, there are two major geographical regions, and most of you will know that. It's the Yuan dynasty in China after the conquest of the Song territories, and then the Ilkhanids in Iran, Iraq, and Anatolia after the destruction of quite a number of Islamic societies on their way to the West. In both areas, this transfer of astral knowledge and its integration into local patterns show one shared pattern. And that to me came as a surprise because I don't know it that clearly from my own research field. Namely, the Mongol Khans played an important role themselves in the transfer and appropriation of astral knowledge at the both courts, at the two courts in Khan Balik and in Marara and later in Tabriz. But then the behavioral patterns of the two Mongol dynasties immediately differ. In China, the great Khans engage in a process of institution building, both for the Chinese astral disciplines and for the newly imported Islamic astral knowledge. So for the Chinese, they can build on the Sung institutions to some degree, but for the Islamic astral knowledge, the previous influx of this kind of things was certainly there, but we do not know too much about it. So there they do really create new institutions, and a little later they do the same thing for medicine. Interesting is, however, that this is not a process of happiness. It is rather a process of several reorganizations and quite serious conflicts. And that sort of speaks against a straightforward success story. No such institution building is undertaken by the Ilkhanids in Iran. Their institution building is continuing previous Islamic patterns, which means the locals, the Iranians, building institutions, partially, of course, in exchange, in conversation, and with the support of the Mongol Khans, but the Mongol Khans are not the instigators. What the Mongol Khans do during their entire 1.5 century of reign is a massive brain drain from west to east. Massive means something 13 to 20 people that we can find in Chinese sources. But for me, that's still massive because they were sort of encouraged and also commanded to move from even far away regions like Anatolia or Iraq up to what today is Beijing. One of the first people whom we know and who played an important role is a Syriac Christian, where we do not know exactly which kinds of languages he knew. There are different opinions. Syriac is clear by his affiliation to the Church of the East, but Paul Pelliot thinks he was actually an Arab Christian, while a colleague of mine, Dror Weil, thinks he is an Iranian Christian. So that we cannot really identify any longer. His name is Isa the Translator, or in Mongolian, Kelemchi. And the other very important person in this transfer to the east of Islamic astral knowledge is Jamal ad-Din Muhammad ibn Tahir, who may have come, or at least his family, from Central Asia, from Bukhara. And as I said, there were quite a number of other people that arrived in China at the court of the Mongols. What the colleagues agree about is that there was no, or at least not much, cooperation between the Muslim and the Chinese scholars. There was no acquisition of linguistic competence on both sides, meaning that one had always to operate through translators. In Mara, in Western Iran, on the other hand, there was some cooperation, at least, between a Persian and a Chinese astral expert. We know the names. The Persian is Nasir ad-Din Tusi, a quite famous scholar in the astral sciences, but also in other disciplines like philosophy and Shi'i law. And Fu Mengji, who belonged to the entourage of Hüligü Khan, the founder of the Ilkhanid dynasty. There's interesting research about Fu Mengji, but I feel I'm running out of time, so I will concentrate here just on one thing, or two things. He seems to have been a Taoist master, which showed that not only Buddhism and Hinduism were relevant in East Asia for the transfer and acquisition of astral knowledge, but Taoism has played its role too. And he transported as the only piece of astral knowledge that we are aware of, the Muslim scholars in Western Iran information about a so-called Chinese calendar, which according to Yoichi Isahaya, who was in Berkeley last week, actually is not really a Chinese calendar, but again, a calendar that is a result of an impact of so-called Westerners from the Tang period, in this time a Sogdian called Cao Shivei in the early 8th century. In this sense, when we look backwards to what happened at the Tang court with its Chinese, Indic, and Central Asian astral experts, it seems to be that the Tang court was more cosmopolitan and more engaged with the exchange of astral knowledge than was the case for the Yuan dynasty, which apparently intentionally kept the two major groups of astral experts, the Muslims and the Chinese, separated. That brings me to my second Mongol dynasty and back to an image. The Indus are a successor Mongol dynasty after the fall of the Ilkhanids for a few years in Shiraz, a small dynasty. And here we have a quite famous anthology of astrological poetry. And you can recognize, I hope, on the left, Gemini. The head that they hold in between them is the head of Rahu as the eclipse dragon. And on the right, I hope you recognize Sagittarius shooting backwards, in this case at the dragon, which is again Rahu, the eclipse dragon. But what is totally unusual is their snake body. And so the question, of course, is from where did the Muslim painter at the Mongol court in Shiraz in the middle of the 14th century get the idea that these two zodiac signs have to be painted on a snake body? And one option is that the Mongols brought some information either directly from China or via Central Asia. As you see here, these are the only humans on snake bodies that we are aware of from East Central Asia. That's Fuji and Nuwa, the first humans on Earth in Chinese mythology. In the center, you see a rubbing already of the Han period, so before 220 Common Era. The two with the snake body and the snake bodies are intertwined. And the other two images are from tombs in Astana, another city in the Tarim Basin. But of course, there is no proof because you see the two tombs are from the 8th century. And of course, we do not know whether anybody coming through the region with the Mongol army could have seen them. So that is one of the many challenging enigmas that the collection of images that we have in the database poses to us. And if someone of you has better ideas or more information, please share that with us. That brings me to the second major development in this exchange of theoretical and technical knowledge between West Asia and China, the Ming Dynasty, in particular in the period of its first emperor, Hongwu, or Zhu Yuanzhang. Here, the interesting element is that despite the fact that this new emperor declared a serious rupture with the predecessors, the Mongols, and styled himself as a restorer of the Chinese culture and political tradition as a son of the heavens. When you look at what he did in the field of astral knowledge, he very clearly sort of copies and repeats a Mongol institution building. He starts with it already before he is emperor in 1367 with an astrological bureau, and 1 year after he has become emperor with a new directorate for Western astral knowledge. And similar things happen over time. There's a lot of tension between the Chinese part and the Muslim part, but Hongwu cannot be deterred. In 1382, he orders 2 Chinese members of the Hanlin Academy to join forces with 2 Muslim astronomers to produce a new astronomical handbook based on Islamic theories, parameters, observations, and calculation methods. But this time, not as with the Mongols in Arabic or Persian, but in Chinese. And this is what happens. And the outcome is what's called the Huiwei Leaf, or the Huiwei Leaf, the calendar or the almanac of the Western astronomers. Within a short period of time, however, a major conflict arose, and apparently Chinese scholars were protesting too much. I don't know the conflict in its details, but what I know is that Wu Buzong, one of the 2 academicians, is killed in this debate, and a short time later, the Directorate of Islamic Astronomy gets dissolved. Nonetheless, further people come from the West to the Ming Court at Nanjing. An observatory is founded and observations are undertaken. And my colleagues, Benno van Dalen and Michoiano, have analyzed the tables of the Huiwei and have observed that there indeed are new observations in the tables for a latitude of 32 degrees that is very close to the latitude of Nanjing. And so they concluded that indeed there was an observatory built by the emperor or on command of the emperor, and that Muslim astronomers like Ma Yi have worked there. But it's even more interesting because they found in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France an Arabic handbook of the year 1366, so 2 years before the Ming Dynasty, written for the Mongol Viceroy of Tibet. And it's called after the compiler, a man whose name we do not know except for Sanjyot, which points to his family's origin in Central Asia, a small town near Samarkand. And they compared the Huiwei Lifa in Chinese and the Sanjyot in Arabic, and found out a very interesting relationship between the 2. Some of the tables in the Sanjyot copy some of the tables, or are informed by some of the calculation and observational results of the Huiwei Lifa. And the same is true for the Huiwei Lifa. It contains some material that is original to the Sanjyot. Now, the Sanjyot refers to one of its sources explicitly by saying that some of the observational data are so-called Jamali observational data. Interpreting this brings us back to the early Mongol period, to the Muslim astronomer who is very famous for this period, Jamal ad-Din Muhammad ibn Tahir, who executed the major observational program, as Benno van Dalen writes, for the observatory in Dadu for the Mongol period in China. And so they conclude, Van Dalen and Jano, that the interlinkage between the Huiwei Lifa and the Sanjyot comes from the fact that both compilers, in the case of the Huiwei Lifa, it's a group, have used the Arabic handbook from the Mongol period by Jamal ad-Din. So that's another sort of evidence for the continuation of Mongol activities in respect to the transfer of astral knowledge and its integration into China, in addition to the institution building and the translation program that Hongwu ordered. So much for the theoretical and technical elements. The Huiwei Lifa has a long life, the Sanjyot did not. It survives only in one copy, which was interestingly again in the Imperial Library in China until the 19th century. So it came from Tibet back to the east. The Huiwei Lifa, on the other hand, has a very rich life. Why? Because the Ming court opened the practice of astral knowledge beyond the walls of the court and allowed non-courtly members to engage with it, starting in the early 16th century. And so a number of private Chinese scholars, both Muslims and non-Muslims, engaged and revised and reformed the Huiwei Lifa until the late 18th century. So much for impact in this particular case. And here you see one of the many folios of the Sanjyot, and on the right, you can read it, I can't, marginalia in Tibetan and in Mongolian. And other folios which I could not copy because I couldn't identify the Chinese, have also register marks from the Imperial Library. That brings me back to some general statements about the Ming Dynasty. So despite the fact that there was quite a heavy investment in bringing foreign astral knowledge to life at the Ming court had an ambivalent attitude towards this Western knowledge. For instance, expressed in the setup and the buildings for the both parts of the directorate. So the Chinese directorate was in the city walls close to the court, while the Arabo-Persian directorate became subordinated under the Chinese one, in contrast to the previous tradition of the Mongols, and was outside of the city walls in a southern suburb. I already said that for some time the Directorate for Arab-Persian Astronomy was closed, and only in 1398, short before his death, the emperor recreated a department for Arabo-Persian calendars or astronomy, depending on how different sources translate the Chinese expression. And the tasks were always the same. That's an interesting element. The task of this foreign directorate was always to produce almanacs, so to produce material for the legitimation of the emperor. This means that other elements that we know existed in China from a library catalog of the year 1273 from the Mongol period, and that we know were transported to Nanjing in 1368, such as planetary models, which are important in the Islamic tradition, but also constellation imagery, which are also very important in the Islamic tradition, were not really of interest, neither to the Ming rulers nor to the Chinese astronomers. So it was a partial acquisition and a partial integration of Islamic astral knowledge that happened both under the Mongols and under the Ming dynasty. But interestingly enough, and that's the last point to the Ming, Hongwu cared enough for the Siege type, the astronomical handbook type of knowledge from the West, to do his best to ensure its survival. And how did he do that? He made an edict that two groups of astral experts, with a Muslim background should be hired by the Directorate for Western Knowledge. One group should go through examinations and learn about Chinese texts and earlier cross-cultural texts like the one from the Dzogchen author from the Tang period, the Fu Tianli, while the others should get their office through inheritance. So they were astral families or families of astral experts, as we know from inscriptions on tombstones, where the father gave the office to the son. And indeed, this kind of tradition can be followed through documents and inscriptions for at least 2 centuries. This brings me to the last slide of my talk, namely back to the scholarly evaluations from which I began my second part. What do they say about the lack of exchange or the lack of impact? So the 3 authors of the history of medicine, history of astronomy and art history, were Loh, Berlekamp, and Wang. They believe at the end of the day, it was a failure, the transfer of knowledge. Why? The argument is a purely technical one. The 2 astral systems were conceptually and technically too different. A very different position is taken by the 2 historians of astral knowledge and cultural knowledge, Isahaya and Weil. Yoichi says in the Mongol period, we have a political and a social factor that prevented an integration of the 2 systems of knowledge. And that is reflected in what I said about the role of the Mongol Khans and their insistence on linguistic competence and separation of the 2 groups. So both the Muslims and the Chinese had as their points of reference the Mongol elite at court, and in particular the Khans, and as a social reference, their own cultural communities for which they made prognostication. But they did not clearly consider themselves as equal and in need of communication. Quite the opposite. The Chinese also protested against the Muslims in the Mongol period and argued basically these Muslims, they don't know what yin and yang is. How can they be our leaders? And the Mongols listened and separated the 2 directories again. In the Ming period, Yoichi thinks it's the emperor who enforced cooperation, partially because there was a loss of linguistic competence. Now, Droer prefers to follow an approach to cultural distribution of knowledge that has been formulated for Islamic age societies by Abdelhamid Sabra in 1987. And it's the idea that one acquires knowledge, then one appropriates knowledge, and in the 3rd phase, one naturalizes knowledge. And so he thinks that both dynasties followed very different strategies to accommodate this foreign knowledge. The Mongols acquired it in, as I said, material form and human form, and let the humans produce this knowledge, and they acquired what was important to their legitimacy and their future, their fate determination, but they didn't naturalize it. While the Ming acquired it with the symbolic act of transfer from one capital to the other, the appropriation under the Chinese leadership, and finally they naturalized it by enforcing its transfer into Chinese. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brentjes, for a wonderfully rich talk, and also for sharing some of the work that you are doing at the Max Planck Institute. So I would like to invite our audience, if they have questions, to just type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. and I will pose them to our speaker. Maybe I can get started, and this is not my field, but I am very interested in how knowledge moves, what happens to knowledge, what moves, what doesn't move, etc. And I'm also very interested in Central Asia, and I know that is sort of by extension, of course, your main field in the Arabic and Persian worlds. And I'm wondering about the Timurids. And I know that there's a lot of disagreement about the level of the astronomical sciences that were conducted at the Timurid court and what the exact contributions were. So I'm wondering, where do the Timurids fit? It's slightly later, or at least, with Ming, it gets very close. Where do they fit in the transfer of knowledge, the madrasas, the institutions that kind of brought together these various scientists from across the Persian and Arab-speaking world? Did they also move scientists from Eastern direction into sort of the scientific communities that were developed there?
Yeah, that's a big theme too. Well, I mean, we know, of course, that there were relationships between the Ming and the Timurid courts, both in Herat, where the head of the family said until 1447, and in Samarkand, where the famous observatory with Ulugh Beg was founded. There were embassies, and there is a report about one of the embassies at the very least, if I remember correctly. I never read it, so I cannot tell you whether it speaks about knowledge transfer. As far as I'm concerned, I never read anything in the Persian sources. I cannot see in the astronomical texts any direct contact with Ming experts. What is the case? This so-called Chinese calendar, it actually is a Jin calendar, according to Isaiah, remains in the orbit of the astronomical handbook production. So it's also in the Ulugh Beg handbook. Yeah? So it becomes a stable element as a calendrical knowledge. But that is really all that we can see from this previous contact. There are other elements that you will know much better in the cultural sphere, of course, in particular in painting, right? Where we have a continued influx, and in porcelain and all that. What concerns knowledge transfer, it's rather within the larger Islamic world. Yeah, so we have movements from Anatolia to Central Asia, from Central Asia back to the western shores of the Caspian Sea, to the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, after the death of Ulugh Beg, one of the last major astronomers, first moves to Herat, then to the White Sheep Court, Tabriz, and from there to Istanbul, where he becomes one of the most influential teachers of the astral sciences in Istanbul until he dies in 1474. So there is ongoing transfer of knowledge. It's really also interesting in comparison to earlier ideas about how knowledge moved in Islamic realms. There's much more going on than we thought. There are things then with the Indian Timurids, with the Mughals going on in South Asia, of course. There's a lot of Arabic material that comes from the West, from Cairo, from Istanbul to India, but also, of course, from Samarkand. And the early Mughals see themselves indeed also, like Babur and Humayun, in the tradition of Ulugh Beg, concerning astral knowledge, and they practice astral knowledge. So there is indeed maybe not a sort of overwhelming the new theoretical astronomy being born, but there is a very solid astral practice going on within the different branches of the Timurids. And you certainly will know this marvelous painting of the horoscope of Iskandar Sultan, of course, to which everybody loses her heart. Yeah? I've seen it, always love it. Right? Yeah, so in this sense, there seems to be again a borderline, yeah, what this kind of knowledge concerns, and this we see more often with the objects too. That's why I said not all of my packages move in the same sense. There are certain packages that move all the way through over centuries, of course, and many changes to Japan, and others, they never arrived there. Yeah? And it's a real challenge to develop ideas how to understand that. Yeah, what are the factors that enable certain things to move but not others?
Right.
That's not trivial at all.
Right. Yeah. There are two questions. I'll read them to you. Thank you for an illuminating talk. You referenced the Silk Road with regards to the transmission route. Could you address the sea route as well? I'm particularly interested in learning whether advancement of nautical technologies was in any way interlinked with an increased interest in the transmission of astral images across the Indian Ocean and the China Seas. Thank you.
I never should have given this talk because it's so outside of my real competence. I know that the sea routes exist. That's I also took this map because sea routes are in there. Yeah, sea routes exist since antiquity. We know that Indians were in Alexandria. I think I forgot that, but I think a few weeks ago a colleague informed me about some Indian paintings at the North African coast. Yeah, so yes, they existed, and I'm convinced that the sea routes are one itinerary or one set of itineraries through which the zodiac was transmitted. Yeah, because with all the difficulties that we face, with pinpointing the exact period and the region when this Greco-Egyptian astrology arrived in South Asia. It is clear it arrived, yeah, and there can be no doubt that there are Greco-Egyptian components quite substantively, technically, and pictorially that come from somewhere in the Mediterranean, in the vicinity of the Ptolemaic and the later Roman rulers of the area to South Asia, and then enable, of course, all this kind of transfer that I described. And one route certainly will have been the sea route. I know something about porcelain and ceramics in the 8th century, and more generally, of course, about Persian and Arab traders who settle in China, but I never read anything about their possible astral knowledge and the exchange of nautical knowledge. On the other hand, what seems to be undoubtable is that some kind of information about the compass must have traveled along those roads. Yeah, we have compass instruments or instruments with a compass in the Arabian Peninsula up to Egypt, between Yemen and Egypt, somewhere in the 13th and 14th century. So at the very latest in this time, it must have arrived from China via India, the Persian Gulf. I do not know. These are always very difficult things because many of the, many is the wrong word, the few Arabic or Persian texts that we really have on such matters are linguistically kind of cleaned. Yeah, so it's very difficult to find sub-layers of foreign languages in these texts. One needs an expert who knows several languages, and we are usually compartmentalized.
Right.
And are happy when we know those languages, but don't know those languages. Yeah, so that makes it difficult. There are new interests in analyzing Persian text on their Mongolian substrate, and there's some progress on that. So it's doable, but I haven't seen such work for the nautical literature.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Next question. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Could you explain more about how important Varaha Mihira's work for us, how important his works for us to understand the astrological knowledge along the Silk Road? Is there any evidence which shows that his works were spread widely or limitedly on the Silk Road? In other words, that kind of...
No. So what I can tell you is that the Varaha Mihira texts, these are several, are extremely important in all of South Asia. Yeah? Across there are too many languages in South Asia, across major language communities. And it's very badly researched. Yeah? So far, research, as far as I'm informed, has focused mainly on the Sanskrit communities. And that's in my view, one of the fundamental problems with knowledge studies in South Asia, that sort of the elite language is privileged, and the non-elite languages, in comparison to Sanskrit, non-elite, but not at all for their cultures, non-elite, are not really important. And there are even really leading colleagues who think that Sanskrit is the only knowledge carrier. Yeah, and the others have not contributed anything under the British occupation to scientific knowledge. I doubt that very much. Yeah, and I think it's rather a reflection of our academic tradition that we don't know enough about this. Now, what concerns Varaha Mihira's text somewhere else, that is again a question one would have to ask people who know Tocharian, for instance, like the second object I showed you, because we have this wonderful library, so to speak, from one of the Donoan caves. And there are fragments, including astrological and omina fragments. And one might find elements from the Varaha Mihira text, but that's a pure speculation on my side. Yeah, but I even do not know whether Varaha Mihira played a role in the Tang dynasty, because what I know is the transfer went on at least two different itineraries. Yeah? One comes indeed from the Tarim Basin with one of the leading Central Asian Buddhist monks in the astral sciences at the Tang court, Amoga Vajra, who is a translator, who translates and newly composes astrological texts. But I didn't hear from my colleagues who work on that Varaha Mihira's texts were involved. Yeah, what I know is that a Greek text apparently was translated at the Tang court, or maybe in Central Asia, and then transported to the Tang court. That's still unclear. The Yusi Jing, whether that has, like some of our images, an intermediary stop in India, is an open question. Yeah? So these are all really, really difficult issues, partly, as I already said, because of the languages that you need to know that are involved, but also because of our own academic traditions. Yeah? We usually, very often in art history, but also history of science, jumped from Greek to one major later language, did not consider the intermediary possibilities so much. And it's a relatively recent development that such questions are also asked.
Yeah, I agree. Brian Bauman has a question. What more can you say about the survival of the Egyptian Deccan system in Asia or in Asian traditions?
Yeah, good question. Very good question. So yes, the Futian Li, there's an interesting article by Yoichi Isahaya and another colleague whom I don't know, who tries to situate a Dunhuang fragment on astrology. No author known, no title. In the activities that I briefly now refer to at the Tang Court. And there's also a short translation of a part of the text. I really recommend to read this, and you see how much and how clearly the zodiac plays a role there for astrology. Yeah, this is really fascinating because the imagery doesn't do the same thing. Right? There's a real rupture between this kind of literature and our objects with images. And I think, at least, with I've forgotten the Chinese technical term for that, there is a threefold combination of planets, always sort of put side by side with a lunar mention, right, in this text. And comparing this with an Arabic source, I checked for the database, the Kitab al-Bulhan, also from a Mongol dynasty, by the way, in Baghdad, has a very similar system combining the zodiac signs with 3 planets always. And what turned out to be the case is these 3 planets are the ruler of the decans. Yeah, so you don't have the decans in any direct pictorial form, but you have represented them through their ruling planets. And this is what I think may be the function of these threefold planets identified with the lunar mentions, that in reality, they are an older representation of the Egyptian decans. But that needs to be discussed with Yoichi.
Thank you. We have, you still feel fine to, we have one more question. And thank you very much for your presentation. Can it be said that astrology was a way of communicating with the gods?
That's even less my competence.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, yeah. At the very least, in the Buddhist context, in the Buddhist context, but I wanted to say in the Japanese Buddhist context, where apparently a particular community of Buddhist monks as experts of astrology emerged over time. There's a particular literature. One of my younger colleagues, Jeffrey Kotick, has written extensively about that. So if you want to know about sort of the religious relevance of astrology in Buddhism, then I would recommend starting there. And I think also it's an interesting development to realize how important Buddhism was for the transfer of this Indo-Greco-Egyptian astrology, which does not fit, at least not in my rudimentary Buddhist training from the university 40 years ago, where no idea of astrology in Buddhism would be even thinkable, right? So Buddhism also underwent quite substantive changes in its relationship to worldly knowledge, which astrology, of course, is. In the case of Chinese and Sinicized groups, yes, we have these texts. And so, yes, there is an interesting other case for cultural integration. As I just briefly hinted at, you get the Chinese lunar mentions sort of translated into, and the other side into the lunar mentions of the Chinese system. So you get 2 or 3 astrological versions fused with each other, so they make sense to each other. And apparently, and that's really just what I read in the train this afternoon, there even is an invention, so to speak, of a new method by the Sogdian guy at the Tang court with the Fujian Li, to enable this translation between the sort of, in this case, speaking Iranian type of astrology, or through Iranian speakers transmitted astrology to the Tang court, that they can indeed calculate the fate of a Chinese individual by using the zodiac and the lunar mentions in the same time. So for such a question, reading these texts would be really absolutely fascinating to understand how, let's say, the larger ideological background is negotiated, whether it's necessarily gods or some other idea about ancestor cult also is not so relevant in my view. And what also happens, and I didn't say that, so the Taoists did a similar thing. Yes, they assimilated important elements of Western astrology in their own system and combined it with their own deities. And so we have images from the Tang dynasty, from the Ming dynasty, of Taoist circles of the zodiac, which show how they sort of integrated them into their own artistic purview. Yeah? So these are all fascinating things.
We have one more question, if you will allow.
Sure.
And then that will be it. Thank you very much. In the history of the exchange of knowledge you talked about today, was there a clear boundary between astrology and astronomy?
I don't believe in that. Yeah, at least for the territories that I know. There are debates, there are conflicts. Yeah, there's laughter, there's division. You have all sorts of human emotions going in different directions. But that there is a clear separation for the Islamic societies, I would not subscribe to. What is clear that not everybody is technically a bright person, right? So there are more people doing astrology on a simple basis than people doing technically complicated astrology. And there are less people even who are doing complicated planetary theory. But I would not think that this has something to do with classification of scientific discipline. And this is where another conflict line was drawn up already in antiquity. Is astrology a science or is it not? Yeah, and some people said it is, and other people said no. And you have the same thing. Is astrology a mathematical science? Or is it a philosophical science? Or is it a occult science? And depending on where people stand, you get, with the Timurids, for instance, at Iskandar Sultan's court in Shiraz and Isfahan, you get the idea, of course, that astrology is an occult science. They are not the first to say that. There are earlier authors. Yeah? There are religious authors who say that. So you see also the boundary to religion gets broken up with these debates. Yeah? So you have many more astrologers. If our sources are to be trusted, then you have high-level astronomers. You have more, clearly so, more texts about astrology than about astronomy. But the madrasa teaches, at least in principle, not every madrasa, but important madrasas do, basic elementary astronomy, basic elementary planetary theory, but no astrology as far as I can say. So how these people who worked at the courts and wrote the almanacs, like in the Chinese case, where they got their knowledge from, I'm unable to say, maybe in the family.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Brentjes, for a wonderful talk, and thank you for sticking around to answer some of the questions by our audience. I also want to thank our audience for not only attending this lecture, but all of our lectures and events this year. And we very much look forward to our next academic year. And you can find information on that as it trickles in. It will be uploaded onto our website. So I want to wish everybody a good summer, and we will hopefully see you in the next year. Thank you, Dr. Brentjes, again.
And thank you for inviting me. And thank you to the audience for coming and having the patience to listen to me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.